The US and China will be at war by 2025. This is according to General Michael Moynihan, who stated this in his bombastic, and all things considered, unusual memo to troops under his command in early 2023. What's scary is that he wasn't alone in thinking this. Soon after, a Pentagon spokesperson and high-ranking military general said that the US national defense strategy makes clear that China is pacing itself in preparation for a war with the US. And the timeline? It's in just the next few years. But is this actually the case? The scary answer is probably. Before we start, let's go over why General Michael said what he said. For decades now, the US military has been worried about China. For some in the United States, urgency in countering China's military threat is often tied to the ambition of Xi Jinping. After doing away with an earlier dictum that China should bide its time and hide its strength, he has stoked nationalism and adopted an assertive diplomatic stance. Now let me emphasize, a war between superpowers would be devastating. The world hasn't experienced anything like it since the Second World War, and technological advances mean any fight between the powers could escalate to widespread destruction, the likes we have never seen. For decades, the United States and the USSR looked to be on a collision course to nuclear war. Thankfully, and with many close calls, this never happened. But the risk is back and stronger than ever. The rise of China has led many to fear conflict with the US is inevitable, with both countries competing economically, militarily, technologically, and for global influence. So the first question is a war with the US and China even possible? China has risen rapidly to become a superpower and is now close to being on even footing with the US. Since 1978, when the country began to open up its economy, China's GDP has risen an average of roughly 10% every year. And while this economic rise has stalled slightly in recent years, partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, China remains on course to become the biggest economy in the world sometime within the next decade. And the leadership in Beijing has been on a mission to use that growth to transform its military. It's widely thought that China is the world's second biggest spender on its military, right behind the United States. But a lack of transparency over Beijing's finances makes that difficult to prove. What's even scarier, though, is that the country is thought to be increasing its nuclear weapons stockpile, rolling out highly dangerous hypersonic missiles, and is already the world leader in cyber warfare. Historically, China has been a land power, but over the decades, it has created a modern navy from absolutely nothing. It has seen more vessels than any other nation. These warships have been built to protect China's interests and project power beyond its waters. And President Xi Jinping has made this no secret. He wants China to have a world-class military, and one that could be fighting and winning wars by 2049. Xi is the most powerful leader China has had in decades. In 2018, the country removed the two-term presidential limit, effectively meaning he could be in charge for life. He's at the center of the government, overseeing all the big decisions, and all the signs are that he wants to use his power and his country's growing economic and military strength to compete with the United States. However, not just compete, but overtake entirely. Let's look at the United States. The US has the largest military, the biggest economy, and is arguably the most influential nation in the world. But China is catching up, and day by day, getting closer to that number one status. The countries have been rivals for decades, but now they are approaching even footing, and a major war is becoming a real possibility. Of course, Taiwan is probably the most likely place for any conflict to start. The small island off the southeast coast of China split away from the mainland after the Communist Revolution in 1949. Taiwan is self-run and democratic, but is also of key strategic importance to the US and to China. Beijing believes Taiwan is rightfully part of its country, and leaders there have pledged to achieve reunification. In contrast, for Washington, Taiwan is a key democratic ally in the region. And recently, US President Joe Biden has reinforced America's commitment to the island, even saying that they would be willing to defend it militarily. Xi hasn't ruled out military force to bring Taiwan into China, and this isn't just talk. In 2021, China started upping the number of military aircraft it sent into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, something many saw as a warning. And in August 2022, a trip by the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan sparked one of the biggest escalations and tensions that we've seen in decades. In response to this, China significantly stepped up its military drills around the island, leading to fears that one misstep could spark into a full-scale war. Luckily, the war games eventually wound down, but it was a clear example of how fragile the situation over Taiwan is. China is more or less secure in its land borders. It has weaker neighbors and a vast army. At sea, it's a different story. It is surrounded by a necklace of democracies with powerful militaries, like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And then around the South China Sea, there are a host of countries, all with their own claims and their own interests to defend. But the South China Sea is vital to China. It is a net importer of energy and food, so control over the waterway could be a matter of survival. It needs to keep those routes open. And the United States knows this. So the US regularly sends patrol ships through the sea, partly to offer support to its Southeast Asian allies, and also to check on the growing Chinese sphere of influence. And with that, it is becoming a key area in the growing competition between the superpowers, and a region where many fear conflict could easily escalate. And of course, China's growth has not gone unnoticed, and its rivals have started teaming up. Fierce competition, flashpoints heating up, and aggression over Taiwan has led many to fear the worst. But if this Cold War got hot, how would it play out? The consequences of such a conflict would spread globally, with much greater impact than the Russo-Ukrainian War. Imagine Taiwanese industry devastated from combat or conquest, allied sanctions against Beijing and its trading partners, and of course, nations big and small forced to pick sides. And at the end, defeat for the US and its allies would be possible, if not likely. In recent years, US war games have generally shown Beijing as the victor. The best case scenario appears to be an indecisive and lengthy war, and this has truly frightened the Pentagon. Currently, it is seeking solutions, but projecting power will always remain more expensive than deterring the use of power. Moreover, this would be the first major conventional war between nuclear-armed powers. Both governments might find it difficult to resort to WMDs in such a conflict. Indeed, the very nature of the battleground would risk escalation. Chinese use of mainland bases would force the US to target them. A key takeaway, though, is that as the time frame for the war moves farther into the future, it begins to favor the United States. Although we highlighted the amazing growth of China after the past few decades at the beginning of the video, what we didn't tell you is that the house of cards is beginning to crash. China is facing a number of economic and social issues that will stagnate their growth in the coming decades. In fact, some analysts even believe that by the end of this decade, we could see the total collapse of China as we know it. But even the most optimistic outlooks highlight one key fact: that 2025 will be China's peak, and their final and only chance to invade Taiwan. Now, if you want to see what's happening to the last great power that invaded its neighbor, click this link.